my graduate advisor, Dick Passingham, was a great teacher and really taught me everything I needed to know in neuroscience, or maybe even in being a good person. He's really a very influential figure and mentor to me. But one of the constant friction was he didn't really want me to go into this field. And I kind of reluctantly get into theory. And I do say I have an inclination. I hang out with philosophers, maybe too much, and I like thinking about this. But every time I do it, I do try to remind myself this is an indulgence, and so I constantly try to force myself to do less theory and more careful experiments too.
What percentage of empirical studies about consciousness do we need to just throw away?
I would think the majority of it, unfortunately. Ooh. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that hurts.
It does.
This is Brain Inspired.
The science of consciousness is a notoriously tricky, slippery, hard endeavor to pursue, as is the philosophy of consciousness. Many of us, including myself, I'm Paul, when we enter neuroscience, we're quickly cured of our desire to pursue it scientifically. But some folks boldly continue the empirical study of consciousness. Hakwan Lau is one of those folks, and he's just released his new book all about it, In Consciousness We Trust. The book documents many of the challenges people like Hakwan face in making progress. It also explains his own recent thinking and work to make progress, and it's also part memoir, documenting his own path thus far. When Hakwan was on the podcast on episode 99 with Steve Fleming, we talked a little bit about this, but in this episode we dive deeper and discuss some of what's covered in his book. So Hakwan is starting his new consciousness lab at the Riken Center for Brain Science in Japan, where he recently took a new position. And in the show notes, I link to his book and how to find out more about him. Those are at braininspired.co/podcast/128. Also, a quick note, I will very soon launch the next round of my Neuro-AI course, which is a series of pretty condensed video lectures on many of the topics related to what we discuss on this podcast and the intersection of neuroscience and AI, plus some other bells and whistles. So if you missed out on the last round or have interest in joining this new round, go to the website to check that out as well, braininspired.co, and in the menu you can click on the Neuro-AI course tab. Thanks for listening, everyone. Special thanks as always to my wonderful Patreon supporters. Happy sciencing out there. Hope you enjoy. Hakwan, welcome back. I know that you are a musician, and I'm curious how your musicianship has been going. Have you been playing lately? What are you playing? Have you been playing lately?
I play all sorts of instruments very poorly. Since the pandemic, I've been mostly playing drums. Actually, I've been practicing those like rudiments on the pad because it's somewhat meditative and it's not really music. It's more like exercise to me.
Oh, nice.
And I try to play piano now and then, but also very poorly, so it doesn't really count.
So I released this Neuro-AI course that I'd been working on for a long time, and I had promised myself that when I did, I would buy this electric guitar and a small amp. I haven't had an electric guitar in a long time because we sold all of our stuff. That's for a different story. But I still haven't pulled, and I released the course, and I still haven't pulled the trigger because I'm afraid I won't play with my toys, and that it won't be justified, essentially. So I'm glad to hear that you're playing. I need to force myself.
Very wise. I think over the years, I think all guitarists in particular, they are very bad at buying new toys. I was guilty of that, buying a lot of new toys and never using them for real.
Yeah. Just, I need the discipline. Anyway, well, I'm glad to hear that you're playing. So, In Consciousness We Trust. This book, well, first of all, can I ask you just to explain the title? I was curious where the title came from.
Actually, it probably came from music. I think a while ago, when I was in the House of Blues, I saw in Blues We Trust, and that slogan left a very strong impression. And I think so. It's just a riff on that, and it really has kind of two indirect meaning. One is that one is the scientific content part. The book ultimately, one of the theoretical idea is that consciousness is the content from perception to cognition. So it's basically consciousness is the interface through which your perceptual content directly impinge on your cognition. So whatever you're consciously experiencing, you tend to trust it. It's very hard to ignore your conscious content. So in that sense, it's the kind of the foundation of everything we believe and trust.
Oh, I see. So it's like wrapped up in the whole perceptual reality monitoring theory. I hadn't put that together. That's interesting.
Sort of. Yeah. I didn't really explain it explicitly either in the book. I just thought, it's okay. People can figure it out. And of course, there's a second kind of sense that it feels a bit like a manifesto, like a political agenda almost. And I also like the ring of it. And again, I never explained it directly how it's connected, but I just left it there.
Well, so reading the book, especially the first half, which goes through all of the thorny issues of empirically studying consciousness, it gave me nightmarish flashbacks to when I was starting in graduate school, thinking about how to apply, scientific practice to study something like consciousness. But you really go through here, forgive the pun, but consciousness is a confounding thing to study, right? Because there are so many confounds to deal with, and you go through them in tremendous detail. And sort of sets the stage for, all of the different empirical issues related to it. So thanks for sending me back into cold sweats there, first of all.
Well, thanks for even reading it. I thought that it would already scare a lot of people away, just opening up the cans of worms.
Well, I'm curious if you had an intended audience in mind, because more so than many of the kind of popular science books that are written about consciousness, this really does dive into a lot of the research and explains a lot of it. So who did you have in mind when writing it?
Yeah, certainly. It was a very conscious decision, pardon the pun, but it was definitely written as a monograph, as a book that is really written for people who already have some interest, or at least in academic research. So we're thinking like graduate students to actual full-time, what graduate students are full-time to, but other, better paid, more better paid academics with more job security. So it's really written for researchers. And I've been obviously warned against it. And people said, why would you write such a book? Nobody would read it. You would not make any money out of it. And that might have even made me realize that, then I definitely need to write this, because there are so many good popular books around and they do such a great job already. I'm not the kind of person who would write a better popular book than the existing ones. But I feel there is maybe a room for a book that is aimed for, maybe a more like a niche audience, where people really want to get into the research, but find that the literature is kind of messy. So this is a book trying to hopefully clean things up for some people.
In some sense, it reads like you are thinking through the ideas yourself in real time. And I don't know if it's written while you were writing it, if you were conscious of your own trajectory, your own journey in studying these things. But that's the way it reads. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think there's a small element of it being somewhat like a memoir. It is something that I've done, as I said in the book, to basically, maybe not so explicitly, but it is something I've done my whole adult life. So ever since I achieved not the consciousness in the sense of having subjective experience, but basically having adult level rationality, that's something that I've always been doing. And this book kind of goes back to the very beginning, and it doesn't reflect thinking on the fly, because all these things I've thought through, I think, the past 2 decades. And that's why I wrote it. But I try to basically recall the whole journey, and especially in some places went into mistakes I've clearly made, and think about the logical errors and struggles I've had.
Yeah. Well, you're very honest throughout the book in documenting your own rethinking of your positions as you've gone along. So I enjoyed that as well, because I think often when you read an account, someone doesn't take the self-reflective time and energy to, I don't know if confess is the right word, because that's the way science is supposed to work. But I enjoyed that aspect of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's in part has to do with the memoir-like aspect of it. I wanted it to be on record to remind myself how easy to make those mistakes, how tempting those mistakes were, but also maybe that's part of the rhetorical intention too, is to really try to say like these are not easy problems, and I think we, in particular, about the positioning of the book is related, right? So there are a lot of popular books out there. They gave very slick and exciting stories, and I think they're great. I mean, they're important for bringing in new audience. But I think for researchers within the field, we have to be honest that we have not thought through these issues. Some of the very basic logical issues, we have not thought it through.
The other thing that I had realized through reading the book is, it may have been like 2 months ago, but this has been on my mind, how valuable it would be to have a sort of, it was a project that I proposed to someone and we haven't moved forward on it. But maybe now we don't need to have like a repository of all of the research studies about consciousness, like with the paradigms, the tasks, the confounds, and your book kind of encapsulates all of that. So maybe I don't need to make that project anymore.
Maybe you should, because that's just my version of it. But at least that's the attempt. And in a way, I hope more people are doing this instead of going for the more exciting, cute ideas, or maybe not cute, even profound ideas. I think we have too many ideas and not enough people doing this organizational work and try to say like, okay, how do we even evaluate these ideas beyond saying that this idea sounds cooler than the other? So I think that's part of the goal.
Well, that harkens to, a lot of people in neuroscience, not necessarily the study of consciousness, but talk about how we are bereft of theory, right? We have all this data, but what we're lacking is theory. But are you saying that in consciousness there are too many theories, or just ideas?
Definitely, I think both theories and ideas, and we have too many of them. I think to the extent that you think neuroscience has too many of them, we have a problem that is much bigger in magnitude. And the ideas tend to be maybe also the nature of the ideas a bit worse. The ideas often people put a lot of personal ascription and stake into the ideas, like this is my greatest idea. Before I win my second Nobel Prize, I should really air out these ideas or something like that. There's a kind of sense of personal indulgence involved, and then the people who test those ideas also tend to have a kind of sense of almost like idolizing the people giving those ideas. And I think that's just not very healthy.
Yeah, you've written about that as well elsewhere in other manuscripts as well. Let me read, I'm going to read a couple quotes from the book here. Here's one toward the beginning of the book, which speaks to the complications. So, all current theories seem to make some rather improbable predictions. Of course, if we know for sure that a theory is correct, we should accept whatever improbable consequences it entails. But I hope that the attentive reader should have been convinced by now that the science of consciousness is just no such simple matter. It's fairly depressing, We're going to talk about the contents of the book and your ideas and your own research more, but I kind of want to linger on this, the difficulty in studying something like consciousness. Have you been, like in your own little journey, like you said, your entire adult life has been working on these things empirically and thinking about them, even, and philosophically as well. I know you interact with a lot of philosophers. Given the complexities and the massive amounts of confounds that you have to think about, it seems, well, for someone like me, it seems likely that I would grind to a halt and just wouldn't find space to continue. Have you ever felt yourself grinding toward a halt and or been so put off by all the complexities or the complications that you've thought of moving elsewhere?
Definitely. Very many times. And, or at least I've thought of, especially about quitting science. So I might still want to think about consciousness, and then I might want to write popular books or just indulge in a bit of unprofessional philosophizing about it, or maybe even becoming a professional. At some point I thought, I have a PhD, it's not in the discipline, but I published philosophy papers that are cited in philosophy. I constantly think, if I just leave science, pack it in, how much would it take for me to retrain myself as a philosopher? And especially earlier on in my career, I constantly thought about that, because doing science in this just seems to be not so realistic at some point. It's not like I don't enjoy the science. At some point, the projection became like, I thought I hated doing science. And every time I was about to quit, I realized, no, actually, I would really miss doing it. So it's not that I don't like doing science, but doing science in this field is really endlessly frustrating. You really feel you're not making much progress, and you're just trying to put out fires sometimes. And, that is very, that actually is still on my mind. Even my recent move from one job to another, I thought about this again, all over again.
But you have interacted with a lot of philosophers, and you continue to, obviously. I know you're friends with Richard Brown, and and you have open dialogues with Ned Block, and on and on. Well, this is a terrible question, but I don't know. Can you describe the difference in interacting with other empirical researchers versus interacting with the philosophy side of it? Because I imagine that the philosophy side is also, I don't know. I don't know if it's less frustrating, but maybe you can just answer the question, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's some frustration too, but they're different. But there's one thing I really like. Maybe I say what I not like about interacting with philosophers first, because it's less important. So I leave the punchline heavier later. So the part is that they, with a few exceptions, like people like Ned Block or my co-author Matthias Michel, many of them are not really that deep into the empirical literature. So these are people, Ned and Matthias are people who sometimes would tell me about papers that I don't know. So in the middle of a debate, they would pull out empirical evidence that I didn't know that existed. And so that's really fun. But most of the time is not quite like that, right? So the philosophers who have any time for me quite often do so to talk to me because they think that I can share my knowledge in science. And so their level of knowledge is not as good. And quite often the debates then becomes very purely conceptual, which is interesting, but it's not always so effective in resolving differences. So that's mildly frustrating. Yeah. But the really good part I really like is, in some way, philosophy is more honest, in the sense that you can, at least it used to be more like that. I think it's becoming a bit different. You can really go and attack your opponent's positions quite mercilessly, and it would not be considered to be unfriendly or bad form. At least most of the time, unless you're really not polite about it. But if you keep some minimal degree of civility, I think they genuinely appreciate back and forth of arguments, because that's how they do things, and they realize the utility of it, which I also appreciate. But in science, of course, you can't really do that so freely. If you take the same kind of combative attitude in science, I tried, you will suffer in your career, because there will be retaliation, and people do remember things, and they get upset, and maybe understandably, when you really attack their work, and it might affect their funding, it affects how other consequences. They don't accept the criticisms as openly as philosophers do.
It seems like more than other fields in neuroscience, the science of consciousness, and beyond science. What I was going to say is that consciousness, another difficult part of it is that you actually do need to know, if you want to study it at all, you do kind of need to know. Consciousness admits much more philosophy than other empirical neuroscience fields, I suppose. So do you feel like you're constantly kind of going back and forth and having to think about the philosophical implications and positions and where you stand on that, and also the empirical side of things?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two sides of it. I think because of my background, my undergraduate training has a bit of philosophy, and then I lived in New York City for a good few years where I interacted with a lot of the major philosophers active in the field. So I tend to actually sometimes just go in and try to steal ideas and borrow ideas and then try to translate them into the language of science, and even sometimes go about testing them. So I benefit from that. But I think even at a more basic level, just thinking about these very, very basic issues about necessity and sufficiency, how do you define what is a theory, and how to avoid confounds. These are things that we scientists supposedly know. These are terms that we don't think of them as philosophical terms, but often we don't really think deep enough about them. In fact, I would say maybe it's a problem in my field, but I think in neuroscience in general, I think most people make mistakes about these terms quite regularly. And because most of the time it doesn't matter, right? If you're in a more mature field, you know what experiments are good and what experiments are bad. Even sometimes you can't articulate it so clearly. You know that certain things are bad. You know that this won't get you published, and then you stop. Whereas in consciousness is more of a kind of Wild West situation, and there's so many things you can try, and people are trying new things, and some of the existing ideas turn out to be completely flawed, but then the field is so small that the recognition of the problem hasn't been become so widespread yet. So you constantly have to apply these, what I call almost like basic critical thinking skills. And once you put it this way, people would say like, no, come on, we have basic critical thinking. We don't need this. And I think part of the book, at least early chapters, to try to convince people, no, we really do. And we, in print, make a lot of really embarrassing mistakes. And if we don't go clean them up, we will be in quite a lot of trouble.
It turns out this stuff is hard.
It's very hard. And convincing people that they're in trouble is a thankless job. And that's why I want to write it as an academic monograph, because I don't think the book would make any money anyway if I try to make it popular and more aimed for a general audience. Basically, I'm a downer. It's not going to sell very well.
Yeah, well, that's why I alluded to my cold sweats that you induced in me. All right, so I'm gonna read another little passage, and this is from the last chapter, chapter 9, and so you write, "When I was young, I thought I would one day write a book to solve the hard problem. I still have not given up on the problem itself, but by now I recognize that it was a deluded idea. At the moment, the best I can offer is summarized in this final chapter, an extended version of perceptual reality monitoring, which includes some elements of quality space theory." So we'll talk about both of those things during the course of the conversation. But I'm keying on when I was young, I thought I would one day write a book to solve the hard problem, really. Do you have, thinking about your own mistakes and your own trajectory in thinking about consciousness and working on it, all the empirical work that you've done, do you have advice to someone who is thinking that they will one day write a book that solves the hard problem, etc.? Someone who's like starting off in their career, thinking of your own.
Yeah, I think at least I can maybe, I'm not sure the advice will be much useful, but at least I can share one element that I totally misjudged and I didn't think it would be so hard. So when I started out, my graduate advisor, Dick Passingham, was a great teacher and really taught me everything I needed to know in neuroscience, or maybe even in being a good person. He's really a very, very influential figure and mentor to me. But one of the constant friction was he didn't really want me to go into this field. He thought that basically, I think most of the first couple of years of working with him, a lot of our conversation goes back to this issue. He would basically try to convince me, why don't you work on something that is more promising? Yeah, because this really feels like it will be wasting your time. And yeah, he would be trying to talk me into a number of different arguments, like sometime about how tractable something would be. And in the end, I sort of won that debate in terms of convincing myself. I never convinced him that he should be doing that, but I think I soldiered on.
Well,
but I think
looking
back, I'm still in it. Yeah. So maybe in a sense I won, but I think one thing I wish I listened more carefully, or I wish I realized was the hardest part is not just the science. The science is hard enough, certainly. And the philosophy is hard enough, but another part is just social. Mm-hmm. You're in science, you're basically constrained by the peer culture, by the peer group culture. I mean, ultimately getting funding, getting published, or even just like getting feedback from your peer group depends on what the peer group thinks. And I think that, basically is a bit of a complaint or one of my downer moments. I think that the culture of the field needs to change a little bit if we need to really move towards a solution to the problem. Yeah.
Do you think that this is particular to the study of consciousness, or because everyone faces a constant barrage, constant friction, right? Do you think it's just accentuated?
Yeah, I think it's the kind of, it's not a categorically new problem. I think the problems exist in some other fields too, but I think having moved around different fields a little bit, even though I never left consciousness, but in order to attack a problem, I would go to different disciplines now and then. At some point I was just doing vision psychophysics for a few years, and then my wife is a sociologist, so I also interact with her colleagues and look into how they think about consciousness. And at some point I do human neuroscience. I sometimes collaborate with people who work with animal models, and I try to dabble a bit in computational modeling. Having looked into how different fields work, I think our field has some really uniquely problematic aspects, and the explanation, although story is clear about how historically we got to this place. So basically there's a historical story of how we got to this place where the emphasis of the field often place so much emphasis on stardom and the popularizing work, which otherwise is really important. I think that the power and influence we allow those populist ideas to gather is really out of proportion. And the other problem is because of the problems of the field being so bad that we have basically gathered together a group of people with a culture that we don't want to talk about those problems. We have a bunch of people who are so good at soldiering on when other people told us that what we do is hopeless. And so we have a culture of people who are kind of resistant to criticisms, and some of them basically just ignore criticism and let it roll off the shoulders and say, okay, you guys been saying this for a long time. I'll do whatever I do anyway. And I think cultures like that are not really helpful to us.
Was when Dick passing him was, I guess, trying to help you out by warning you against it. Was that sociological, or was it the science part that he was warning against?
I think mostly the science part. I wish he warned me more about the sociological part, but at that age I wouldn't have understood anyway.
Or cared.
Yeah. I thought, like, why do I care about my peers? I'll just do my science. If they're wrong, I would just be right. But no, I think I come to learn you're really ever only as good as your peers, and because it's a group activity. So the last few years I've been trying to maybe try to change that culture a bit without much success, frankly, but I think it needs to be done. Yeah.
Well, that's how you actually finished the book, talking about the sociology of all this as well. And yeah. All right. Well, enough of the culture here, and maybe we'll get back to it in a little bit. So, like I said, the first half of the book you devote to explaining all of the intricacies and difficulties in empirically studying consciousness. Well, one of the things that you do is you kind of lump a lot of, in some sense, you lump everything into local versus global views of consciousness. And I know that's, not necessarily a fair distinction. In your own perceptual reality monitoring, you're trying to kind of go between the two as well. But can you explain the difference between local and global views? And then we'll get into perceptual reality monitoring.
Yeah, so these are somewhat caricatures or, goalposts. They're not a fair, detailed description of the entire lay of the land, but I made an analogy that sometimes to get the lay of the land, you just want to learn a few landmarks and some very coarse-grained orientation. So global theories, as the name suggests, would suggest that consciousness involves some kind of informational broadcast throughout the many areas of the brain. So if you're conscious in the sense of having a very simple subjective experience of just seeing a color patch that is red, just seeing that redness involves way more than your visual neurons that are selectively tuned to redness in the early visual areas. It involves pretty much the whole brain, many areas, frontal, parietal, those higher association cortex areas. And then local theories basically says the opposite. It said if you see red, those neurons tuned to red is why you see red. And those higher cortical areas in prefrontal, parietal areas, those are just for the further thinking about that experience or the reporting of that experience or maybe even attention to that experience, but it's not the experience itself. So that's the major distinction. I think that has been very useful to focus on because people do fall basically at least along the spectrum somewhere.
And so we talked about perceptual reality monitoring last time that you were on, when you were on with Steve Fleming, but to spare people to have to go, search for that and listen to it, could you just kind of recap what perceptual reality monitoring is and how it fits into the local and global views?
Yeah, so basically, perceptual reality monitoring theory is a variant of another class of theories, sometimes called higher order theories. And the idea basically is that the local guys are not wrong. There is a sense that when you see red, the early visual activity that directly selectively tuned to these content, they represent what is called the first order content. So you need redness to see red, but it's not sufficient. And on top of that, presumably you need some higher order activity. And PRM, perceptual reality monitoring, is just kind of like an empirical story or a neuroscience story trying to explain why that philosophical notion that you need something higher order, why is it plausible? And the idea is, well, when your early visual areas, when the neurons coding tuned to red, when they fire, there are a number of possibilities that they fire, right? It could be because you're actually seeing red. It could be because you're just imagining red. So we know the top-down imagery also activate some very similar activity. And it could be that those neurons just fire spontaneously because noise is everywhere in the brain. And so because of these differences, then it's very plausible that there's some downstream areas that try to read out or monitor the early sensory activity representing red and try to make the inference and say what it really reflects, right? So if you say like these neurons, these red tuned neurons are firing at 50 hertz, the higher order monitoring mechanism might decide, well, this is just baseline noise because baseline noise is about this level, so let's just ignore it. Then you would have no conscious experience. You shouldn't have any conscious experience anyway. And when it makes a mistake, so if it's actually noise, but if it thinks that, oh, this is actually higher than baseline noise level, maybe it did the statistics wrong, then you'll be hallucinating. So that basically is a way to say, well, you need this kind of late stage self-monitoring engine. And when that engine makes a mistake, it accounts for why you would have hallucination, why you would dream, why you sometimes see things normally, and why you sometimes don't see things when you should, and etc. So that helps to argue why the prefrontal and parietal mechanism are important, but the first order is also important too.
And you've in your earlier manuscript, you have tied this together with the notion of generative adversarial networks and how a similar mechanism works with GANs as well. Yeah.
So part of the at least one criticism the philosophical theory of higher order theory has been have to face, and some authors, some philosophers, because of the argument, actually left the higher order camp, was that they think that it's not plausible that the brain would grow this higher order organ, right? So you have a first order signal that says red, why don't you just tag it there or use some dynamics to just distinguish the cases? Why would you grow another thing on top to try to monitor it? It sounds so clumsy and so much like a homunculus. And so some people think that it's just empirically not plausible. And so using the GANs argument is to say, well, actually, if you look at just an artificial neural network, where people just try to solve engineering problems, they end up doing something very similar. So it may not be so implausible that evolution equipped us with this kind of higher order monitor. So in the context of GANs, the idea is that to train a top-down generative model, going from the concept of a cat to the actual first order representation of a cat, an image-like representation of a cat, to do this kind of top-down self-generated imagery, it would be very useful. We know that it can allow you to do predictive coding and all sorts of nice stuff. And the problem about this is training those networks takes a lot of time. And turns out there's a trick called GANs, Generative Adversarial Network. I think it's been called one of the coolest tricks in machine learning in the past decade by Ian LeCun, I think. And the trick is basically to set up one network that would try to do this generative predictive coding, and another network that was basically to try to compete with the generator, and they call it the discriminator. You basically look at the generated output and try to tell whether it actually is just generated or whether it's actually a real image of the world. So you're basically trying to do forgery detection, they call it. So you take an image and then say, well, this is generated by the generator, or is it actually a sample from the world? And then the two can then compete. Because if the discriminator catches the generator making a forgery, if it doesn't look enough like a real world sample, then it would try to punish the generator. If the generator managed to slip in a forgery, passing the detection of the discriminator, that is, you generated something that looked enough like an external real stimuli enough, then the discriminator will lose a point. When you set them up to compete, then they both would grow very quickly. So it's just for solving an engineering problem, but you see that the discriminator is a bit like the higher order monitor that I talk about, right? You essentially look at your own sensory activities and say, well, this is generated by myself, or it is generated or is triggered by the external world.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around kind of where you situate subjective experience, right? Because I think most theories or most approaches to thinking about consciousness kind of pit it at this highest level of being, right? That it's like at the end of the processing stream, whether that's a local processing stream or a global thing, it's kind of like the end all, right? Oh, and then there's consciousness. But yours seems that the PRM version, the discriminator reality monitoring type version, seems kind of in the middle of cognition, right? Because then you have these lower order cognitive sensory modalities, things like that, processing, that then the reality monitoring system monitors that, and then, am I right, passes it along to do some other higher order cognition that is not part of subjective awareness.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a great question. I think that's the problem or the fundamental tension between the two camps. The localists, the first order guys said, well, we're just talking about seeing red. So of course we should look at the visual cortex and look for those neurons that clearly tune to red. All these later on cognition is just cognition. What does it have to do with seeing red? And then the higher order guys does sometimes come across as if we're over intellectualizing consciousness. We sometimes come close to, because of the jargons in philosophy, we come close to almost saying, well, seeing red is a thought. And it's about really higher order cognition. You have to have sense of self, and you have to be self-aware to do all of this. And then the local guy just said, well, you just talk about something else. I'm not talking about that kind of consciousness, like what the social scientists would talk about, like false consciousness, collective consciousness. I'm not talking about that kind of highly intellectual self-narrative about things. I'm not talking about your rationality. I'm just talking about the simple feeling of seeing red. So obviously, you guys are just talking about something else, so we ignore you. And so I think my game plan has been to try to convince the local guys that, well, even when let's say we just really talk about simple experiences, Sometimes not even things that you're attending to, not even things that you conceptualize and think about. I think there's already a case to be made that there is some higher order impact. Like the GANs, like self-monitoring. You just to sort out whether you're actually hallucinating red or seeing red, or your red neurons are just firing randomly because of noise. You need some sort of implicit self-monitoring. And I emphasize that it's really implicit. It happens automatically. It's not something you have to think about. And presumably very young children and small animals would have the same mechanism, even though they may not even know explicitly what a self is. It's just that it's like the GANs. It works automatically. It's not something you have to activate and spend cognitive effort to do. And then they would say, well, yeah, okay, so if that's true, then how does it relate to all the other really high order stuff that the sociologists and people talk about? Then I think, well, then it's probably because you have these GANs like decisions to decide whether your first order input decide what they reflect, because then that outputs to the really higher order stuff, the self-narrative and etc. So your self-narrative and the higher order cognition takes an input from the implicit higher order monitoring. So exactly. So consciousness is exactly the interface between the early century perceptual stuff to the really higher order cognitive stuff.
But so the brain is highly recurrent, right? So those
right.
higher order areas where we do sense of narrative and sense of self, can those reverse and become inputs into the reality monitoring interface as well, so that they are like first order systems in that respect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they do, but to the extent that reverse input happens, it is probably modulatory, so it provides some context. It might impact it a little bit, but the impact is not so strong, and I think it's not really constitutive to having experience. And so when you change your culture, when you just move to a different country and speak a different language and immerse it for decades, presumably changes your whole brain to some extent. I think just like, or drinking wine, people talk about if you become a really wine buff or connoisseur, which
Scotch,
I'm not.
It's Scotch,
yeah,
right?
Right. Scotch, actually, yeah, Scotch is a good idea. I used to not like Scotch, and now I like Scotch. So probably changes some of my very early, kind of olfactory and taste processing to some extent. But that's kind of like an indirect route. It's not like that as soon as you think of Scotch and everything changes at that level. Yeah.
One of the reasons why I'm asking about this, and you write about the functions, the potential functions of consciousness in the book. And so positing it, like situating our subjective experience sort of in between, gives the worry that maybe our consciousness doesn't have as much functional relevance as we would like it to have, right? It's a little scary, right? So first of all, just to understand consciousness, is it important to understand what function it may subserve, or can we learn about consciousness without understanding its functions, without an account of its functions?
Yeah, I think yes, but it's also not so straightforward. I think in general, like all the constructs in psychology and cognitive science, maybe even neuroscience, most of the target phenomena are defined functionally, right? So we say like we want to study memory. Nobody would study a kind of memory that doesn't remember things, right? So memories are the way they are because they store information for future retrieval and use, etc. So attention, people sometimes say is vague, but as a functional concept, we also know it try to filter out some useless stuff or irrelevant stuff for the current purpose and try to boost the signals and gate them for downstream processing. We can talk about a function like this. It's probably good to have, and then we can go and map out how the brain might implement the function. When it comes to consciousness, it's trickier because there's a lot of kind of hand-wavy saying about, consciousness must have evolved to do X and Y, and it's really not a lot of empirical evidence that it does. And if you think about how to even get empirical evidence for that, then it kind of goes into this kind of chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
That if you define consciousness as self-reflection, well, then you will find the self-reflection stuff to be the correlate. But then your opponents are going to say, well, but why do we define consciousness as self-reflection? It may not have those functions. And so it's a pretty tricky problem. And I tend to side with the local theorists there, in that they basically assume that consciousness has very little function, right? At least in terms of higher cognition. So they would say basically, if you, in the more extreme version that some people actually hold, but maybe not a lot, but they would say if you cut out your visual cortex and put it on a petri dish and keep it alive, it would have, red qualitative experience, even though there's no downstream cognitive circuits to appreciate it. Some people do think so. So basically that would have no function. And some people think so long as it has the right network properties, even though is completely detached to input, output, is not even functioning, it would have red experience, even if it doesn't do anything. I think that sounds extreme, but I think it's a good starting point. As in, we should define a minimal notion of what red experience is. Maybe not as extreme as the petri dish guys, the panpsychists. But we can at least say, well, red experience is just being able to potentially report about red experience if you're able to report, right? So assuming that you can report about stuff, then having red experience is to have the propensity to be able to report it. And that's it. Maybe that's a kind of more minimal definition. Or maybe you can add a bit more, right? You can see, well, being able to see red is to be able to see it as not blue, right? So that also makes sense. And be able to see red maybe is also like you can see it as more like orange than blue. That also seems almost like a given. If it doesn't have these functional properties, I don't think it's the same phenomena anymore. But should we assume that being able to see red is to be able to associate it with danger and to be able to slam on your brake when you see it on the traffic light? I think those I would try to not assume that is the case. And then having this minimal definition, then map out the circuit, then we can actually then empirically investigate what are the normal functional advantages associated with that more minimal circuit.
This gets into the idea of mental quality space, right? So I guess my opening question would be, if seeing red was the only experience, this is an impossible thought experiment, but was the only experience one could have, then I guess you would posit that one is not having a conscious, the first time you see red and you've had no other experience, you actually don't consciously perceive red, that you have to see red and then a little something different from red.
Yeah, I think for humans, I'm not sure, but I think for let's say for a creature that has evolved without any history of seeing any other color, then I think it would not see red as red. It would just see a flash of light. Yeah, it doesn't have that dimension, right? So I think that dimension comes about because we have, maybe also in our evolutionary history, we have equipped our sensory cortex to be able to distinguish these different things. Then seeing red is about seeing it as not something else. Seeing red is seeing it as it is redder than everything else. So in relative terms, it has a distinct quality. And I do think that is part of the almost like the basic function or the minimal functional definition that you should have. Otherwise the theory runs the risk of basically being a theory of reportability. It doesn't explain the qualitative aspects.
Well, so can you explain a little bit or describe a little bit what mental quality space is, and then talk about how you've incorporated it within the perceptual reality monitoring account? Because this is something you kind of thought about more recently than the PRM idea itself, right?
Yeah. That's an example of where I totally went into philosophy and borrowed something from philosophers. Oh. So and then try to mash it with the science. So the PRM story, despite its controversy and all that, I think we have a pretty good. It has gained some scientific traction, so it has made some impact in the field, and I think I can I can give talks and list out the empirical evidence in favor of it. It's not a done deal, as in science. Many of these things won't ever be so soon. But at least I think there's enough scientific support. I can say that it's a scientifically tested and partially supported theory. But the problem is then it doesn't address this issue of why red looks the way it does. It tells you, okay, if you have some red tuned activity in the brain, then you know when it will be conscious and when you'll be hallucinating it. You know when you cannot report it. That's great, but it doesn't seem to get at the deeper issue about why red have this qualitative aspect, why it looks different from the other colors. So it turns out mental quality space is a concept that can be traced back to at least Wilfrid Sellars, and then in more recent times, Austin Clarke and David Rosenthal also wrote a lot about it. So the idea, and sometimes some other people call it a structuralist view of perception, which is to say the perceptual content has to be understood in relation to all the other perceptual content that you can have. So red looks the way it does because it is more similar to orange and purple and pink and brown, more similar to these than to black and white and silver and blue and stuff. So because of the, if you want to express what it is like to see red, you can basically find out all the pairwise comparisons to all the other, maybe not just color, all the other possible sensations you can ever have, and write down all exhaustively how each pairwise similarity is. Then you would basically describe what red is like. There's nothing more to be known. And I find it quite plausible. And strangely, my strongest critics in the localist, the first order camps, also seem to think that there's some traction there. So I like the idea. I think conceptually it works, but then the problem is, but it's so philosophical, right? So how do I combine that with PRM? That was the what I did in the book, in the final chapter. So the idea is, so PRM, as I mentioned earlier, is about your sort of higher orders implicit self-monitor, maybe like the discriminator in a GANs-like architecture. It basically tried to look at or try to monitor the all of this is, mechanistically done. It just basically tried to look at the early sensory activity and make a decision as to say, well, this activity has these dynamic properties that, given my statistical understanding, it is reflecting the state of the world right now. So you better be conscious of that. So that's the decision. And if you think about that, then the higher order monitor has to have some sort of address book. It has to know what these neurons and those neurons are in the early sensory cortex, right? And interestingly, the early sensory cortex, we look at it so often we forgot how unique it is. It has some nice properties that are not necessarily there in artificial perceptual mechanics, right? So the neurons are very sparse. So at the same time, if let's say you're seeing red, only a small number of neurons are involved in that. Not your entire sensorium has other neurons, like in the touch and tactile and auditory cortices. They are not involved. Or even within the color sensitive neuron, not every neuron is involved. So has this sparse coding property that is not really so trivial, and it also is quite smooth, right? The representation, as we call it in neural networks, it falls into a continuum. So that means that for two sensory experiences, you can almost like trace down the address. You can say, well, this experience is basically mostly driven by these neurons. And then the other experience is mostly driven by those neurons. And you can talk about these two addresses. They are like a population profile. And then you can talk about how these two addresses are, how much they overlap, because it's a smooth continuum. So for any two experiences, there's some meaningful degree to which they are similar and some degree they're not similar. Basically, if they overlap a lot, if there's a lot of crosstalk, then you might actually confuse them. So that means that the higher order monitor, to the extent that it can do its higher order job by, pointing at these early sensory coalitions and say, well, this is reflecting the world, this is not, this is hallucination, etc., then it must know this address layout, right? In some way, know in a implicit sense. I mean, the computations at the higher order level has to somehow be respecting and tracking the whole address, the whole sensory layout of the sensory cortex.
Well, is the whole address, or is it the differences?
Yeah, I would say it actually holds the address almost. So if you again, I use these kind of natural language analogies. Sometimes it get read wrong. I don't really mean there's a little man sitting in the prefrontal cortex doing this. Yeah. But it's as if you tell the prefrontal cortex that, you know, this experience is coded by these neurons. You can number them like these. They're coded by neurons 57 to 78, with some, you know, fuzzy edges and etc. And if you tell them, then the prefrontal cortex should know, oh, okay, those are color neurons. I know that. And those color neurons are very far from another experience, which is coded by neurons 122 to 138, because these two populations are physically wired in a way that they are quite far apart. So in a sense that your prefrontal cortex kind of knows what an experience is like, almost like you get it for free. It's the analogy I use in the book is like a dictionary. If I tell you that a word is on page 5 of the OED, you basically can guess a bit what that word is. And if I tell you, well, how similar is that word to another word which is on page 505 in a dictionary, you will know they will be very different. The first few letters will be probably different. And so likewise, if you know the layout of the address, which the prefrontal cortex, I argue, it has to, because otherwise, how can it send all these top-down signals to do attention, cognitive control? It has to have some internal, maybe implicit grasp of the whole address system. Then in a sense, that's maybe how you get the mental quality space kind of for free. And I say for free, it's not really free. I mean, evolution probably equipped us to do this because there are advantages to sparsity and smoothness and this kind of architecture.
So I have a few more questions that are just kind of popping into my mind, because I think I thought about this reading your book, and I don't remember if you address its relation to the cognitive map. So navigation has been really hot in the past few years in neuroscience, and that then has extended. And the fact the idea is that we have this cognitive map, and how does it get encoded? But then multiple studies have extended the idea of the cognitive map to abstract spaces as well. And I don't know if you've thought about how this address kind of approach relates to cognitive maps.
Yeah, great question. It's not in the book, but it's in a paper coming out. And the story is nice. So it's one of those online meetings during the pandemic where I presented this mental quality space ideas. So actually, I got into mental quality space right at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was nothing else to do, and I sat on my balcony.
That's like a primacy effect, right? You remember the beginning of the pandemic and what you were doing.
Yeah, basically, this whole is a pandemic child. This whole MQS idea, and part of the problem is now, okay, having gone through a semi-empirical story, having constructed this semi-empirical story, and has to do with sparse and smooth coding and GANs, then how do we test this idea further? I mean, it sounds like it still is kind of almost like a philosophical story. It has some empirical assumptions, but how do we test it? We are not going to be able to change the cortex to make it less sparse. I suppose it will be kind of tricky to do. But then my friend and Steve Fleming pointed out, well, maybe we can actually hypothesize that the higher order side, when I say the addresses has to be incorporated somehow, I was being very vague about this. Mm-hmm. And thinking about the implementation is not easy. And I was hoping some other clever computational modeling people would sort it out. But then Steve said, well, but there is an idea, which is exactly like this explicit or sort of explicit grid code that is used for spatial navigation in the brain. And we know that how when we actually spatially navigate physical space doing locomotion, we know that in rodents and in humans there are grid cells that encode the space and we allow us to do this navigation. And we know that they have been used for abstract stuff, like you pointed out. In fact, there was one study that I think is the first also BAO, and I think they actually found that in olfactory sensory space, if you make people navigate over an olfactory space that is, a space defined by the intensity of different odors. So it's not an actual physical space, but it's just an abstract space defined by different olfactory stimuli. By navigating through that, it seems to activate some grid-like representations in the prefrontal cortex too. So then Steve thought, well, why don't we just go and test it? So we wrote a paper, and maybe we'll be doing that. I didn't try to update the book because the book at that point was already written. And I also think it is probably a very long shot. And so that's one possible way the prefrontal cortex handle these address, which is to put these different sensory addresses onto a space, an abstract space, and actually then try to use other machinery or mechanisms for spatial navigation to actually try to navigate around that space. It will be wonderful if the brain actually does that, and if it does that whenever a conscious experience occurs, right? It's not just that in some trained task the brain can be trained to do something like that. I think, I can be trained to think about color in terms of a 2D space, but when I just see color, I'm not sure my brain already instantiate this kind of space or this kind of spatial navigation activities. But it's a nice hypothesis that we can test. So we're doing that now. Cool.
So I don't know if this is even we'll see if it's even a question worth asking, but I'm continuing to try to flesh out kind of the situation where, subjective experience is situated. So for PRM, it really does not depend on any model of the world, right? So it doesn't need to connect to something like Bayesian brain where we are, constantly having to try to model the world. It's really more like a gating discriminator mechanism. So does it depend on a model or relate to models?
I would say it has a model of your sensory activity, right? It has the statistics of your sensory activity. Yeah. But it's not explicitly a model of the world. I think the model of the world is probably downstream.
So not in the conscious realm.
Or consciousness will feed into that model of the world, and the model of the world might feed back to this mechanism too, to some lesser extent. But the constitutive mechanism for having the simplest conscious experience requires having a model of your own sensory activity rather than it doesn't require a model of the world, at least I would think.
Of the world, right. So your science career, my science career also, my academic career was devoted to visual neuroscience, essentially, although I tried to study metacognition, but in a visual paradigm, right? And the vast majority of consciousness talk is about visual. Seeing red is the paradigmatic example. Is it useful to think about other sensory modalities? I know you just mentioned olfaction and the kind of cognitive map that can take place in our olfactory senses. But is there, in testing theories of consciousness, is it a useful approach to try to triangulate among the different sense modalities? Because vision is laid out topographically, right? And you were just talking about how olfactory has this kind of topographical smoothness as well. But it seems if a robust theory of consciousness should be able to account for all the senses, right?
Yeah, definitely, and that's one of the limitations of current research that we are we should be very mindful of this limitation. Much of it is done in vision. There's a smaller degree that is done in auditory and tactile, and olfaction is really tiny. I see it as a problem and should be addressed, and hopefully the theory would generalize to the other cases. And I sometimes think that hope is hopeful, wishful thinking, but at the same time, it's also the norm in science, where we start with a paradigmatic case and hope that it generalizes until it doesn't. That's how science is done usually, basically. So, and the excuse for doing that, or the reason for doing that is because mostly just is experimental convenience, right? So we know that the visual system is well understood and it's easy to control the stimulus, and you can stimulate the entire visual field pretty easily. So doing tactile is a lot harder. You're stimulating a much smaller portion of the whole tactile cortex because of the way that is spatially organized. So you're just stimulating a small part of it. So your signal, if you do whole brain imaging, is going to be small. And when it comes to olfaction, the sensory fatigue it kicks in very easily. Getting people to smell like 50 different stimuli, they usually want to get out. Whereas making them to click on a few thousand Gabor patches, surprisingly, people are pretty good at doing that. So mostly these kind of convenient reasons we started with vision, but eventually, we do have to test whether it generalized to all of them.
You've worked on a lot of different experimental modalities, right? So you've used largely fMRI, but you've also stimulated with transcranial magnetic stimulation. Where is our limit? I know we have multiple limitations, but can you imagine, is technology holding us back? If we had better recording devices or some technological breakthrough, would that actually help? Or do we have the necessary tools now? We just need to ask better questions and have better theories to test.
I think that technology would certainly help a lot. It will be game changing. But I also think that the people who are very keen on pushing those boundaries, good for them. But I think they often also neglect the simpler problems like confounds. I mean, with a better scanner, you still have the same confound. So if your concepts aren't right, it would still be problematic. So in a way, I feel I'm in a good place. I think the field is moving. There are new technologies. I can get my hands on them, but I'm also not like frustrated more frustrated by not getting to those new tools sooner, because even at the current technology, there are still a lot of conceptual cleaning up that needs to be done.
I kind of gleaned over what is a massive part of the book in talking about all of the different important issues related to and thorny issues related to the studying consciousness empirically. So I'd like to ask you just about a couple of those, and then can leave readers to discover the rest of them in the book. One of the things that you argue for is that task performance capacity is a crucial issue. So could you just describe what you mean by that and why it's important?
Yeah, so it's one of those confounds that are maybe not so obvious, and some people deny that is even a confound. So the idea is that if you want to study consciousness in the sense of subjective experience, then you really want to find experimental manipulations so that you just change subjective experience but nothing else, right? You want everything else as much as possible to be held constant. So people quite often would focus on stimulus confound. So when you change the subjective experience, if you change it by changing the stimulus itself, well, then you find some differences in the brain. You don't know whether it's because the difference occurs because of the difference in subjective experience, or maybe just the physical stimulation itself changes the input. So you need to control for that. And I think it's not a trivial problem, but I think the entire field is aware of this problem, and a lot of effort has been spent to address that. And you also need to address things like reporting, right? You don't want to be, let's say you turn an experience on and off. You don't want it to be the case that when the experience is on, they have to report, and when there's no experience, they don't report. Then you have the same reporting confound. And again, I think it's not entirely trivial, but people have dealt with that, and I think it's pretty good. And I think the problem is it's a subtle point, but the confounds that are subtle are actually the worst confounds. Because the confounds that are relatively obvious, that means that other people would have taken care of it. And if you look at the literature, then the answers would be mostly immune to those confounds if you look carefully and pick those studies that control for the confound. And task performance capacity is the confound that is so subtle that I think very few people have taken the trouble to control for that. So what I mean is when you're aware of a stimulus, you have a conscious experience, that's good, but you're also more able to do tasks in relation to that stimulus. And you can identify it, you can remember it better, you can talk about your capacity for doing things related to that stimulus is also stronger. And that applies to all the paradigms in consciousness, even though in some cases when you don't have to do a task, right? In binocular rivalry, I think when I first raised this question back in almost over a decade and a half ago, people would say, well, but binocular rivalry doesn't have this problem because you're not asked to do a task. And that's why I realized, okay, I must emphasize is performance capacity confound, is not performance confound. Even when you don't ask them to do a task, obviously, when let's say you're seeing a dog and a cat rivaling in a binocular rivalry paradigm, when you see the cat, obviously you're much more able to detect subtle changes in the cat image than the dog image. And in fact, that has been done. So we can make people do tasks in the context of binocular rivalry. And of course, unsurprisingly, the image that is conscious is much better processed. So that confound is pretty damning, because I think it means that if you're not careful, your theory of consciousness might end up just being a theory of how the brain works. And I suspect that most current theories are actually just how the brain works, because that confound is not being taken care of. So when you say I compare the conscious condition and a non-conscious condition, these activities in the brain show up when you're conscious. Well, maybe those activities are just driving information processing in some ways. And yeah, of course, when you're conscious, then you can do things, you can remember, you can do cognition. So you need to control for that. And some of my colleagues would say, no, you don't. You absolutely don't need to control for that, because being able to process information is consciousness. So there's no way you can control for that. It's like saying that I try to compare tall people versus short people, and let's control for the length of the bones, right? Well, you can't, right? Because tall people are tall because their bones are longer. Like that, you can't control for the very thing itself. And that's, I think, when the issue of the phenomenon of blindsight comes in. Because blindsight, to me, even if it happens very rarely and some of the cases are controversial, to the extent that it has ever happened in the entire world to some extent, is an empirical counterexample to the conceptual identity between consciousness and performance capacity.
Let me stop you there, but I just want to mention, because I don't know if I've told you this before, and then we'll talk more about Blindsight, but some of your early work on Blindsight was inspirational to me when I was trying to form my own graduate studies. So thanks. I'm not sure if I've ever said this, but thank you
I didn't know.
for those early studies.
I didn't realize I didn't think that. I didn't. Now I realize I'm older than you are. I always thought I read your paper, the single cell recording paper on metacognition. That actually was very useful to me too, but I didn't realize that my work somehow has an impact on you too. Okay, good.
Oh, I was trying to. It actually helped me devise the task. Thinking about the patient
Wagering.
GUI and those early blindsight studies, So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to express my gratitude to you. So.
Very glad. That makes my day. Yeah.
So Blindsight.
Yeah. So in Blindsight is a case where lesion to the primary visual cortex cause some patients to deny that they have any sense of subjective experience. Sometimes the denial is not so complete, right? Some people will say, well, they can see motion but not static stimuli, and sometimes it applies only to some stimulus parameters. But to the extent that you find those stimulus and then they say they really don't consciously see them, the interesting part is they can guess what the identity of the stimulus. So, and when I mean guess, you just give them two buttons and they press buttons. So they are basically doing psychophysics tasks like you and I do, because when I do psychophysics tasks, usually people don't ask me if I'm guessing or seeing. They just ask me to press the damn button. And those patients can do exactly the same. And then they can achieve a fairly high level of accuracy, like 80% correct. So D prime of above 1. So they have a solid signal to noise ratio of more than 1. And so that means that is a case that demonstrates that the subjective experience is not always required for them to process information. So the two things are not the same. So they're not the same equivalence relations as being tall is having long bones. Because now I find a case of a person who's very tall but doesn't have very long bones. So to the extent that one case has been shown, that means that while the two are different, then you need to control for them. But very few people do. And I think that is maybe one of the biggest problems the field is facing now.
And how does perceptual reality monitoring account for blindsight?
Yeah, so the nice thing about these kind of higher order theories is that we assume that most of the functional work is done by the first order representations. So just having a strong first order signal would allow you to be able to guess the identity of the stimulus. So you can do the Blindsight guessing task or any psychophysics task that way. The higher order monitoring or the perceptual reality monitoring is almost like a commentary on the first order signal, right? So you have a strong ongoing first order signal in the sensory cortex that might go through your parietal action channels and allows you to do those tasks. But on top of that, you almost have a higher order commentary and say, well, this signal now reflects a state right now. So you have the conscious experience. But if that is missing, that's where you have blindsight. So maybe your higher order monitor makes a statistical error, and even in the presence of a very strong first order signal, it said, well, no, that's just baseline noise. Let's ignore it. So you don't have the conscious experience. But if the first order signal is in fact strong, then it can drive the performance. So you have a performance without awareness in that case.
So presumably there are quote unquote normal subjects in the population who, may experience what would amount to blindsight on every 15 trials of some task, right? Because you have this ongoing monitoring situation, and sometimes it fails. Is that plausible that it's just sometimes failing to discriminate correctly and therefore would lead to something like a blindsight trial or something?
I would think so. I would think theoretically and intuitively it is quite plausible, but the empirical demonstration turned out to be really difficult because we don't know when people just say that they're not conscious in that trial, maybe they mean that it's just faint, and so the empirical demonstration has been hard, and a lot of people are very skeptical of blindsight. Some people are even skeptical of whether blindsight existed ever. So that, but I think if you go for the more solid evidence to show that blindsight existed at least in some conditions under some rare patients, I think that is a defensible position.
So Hakwan, I want to we'll wrap up here with just a couple sort of broader questions again. Like I've repeated multiple times, you really analyze a lot of these studies and the potential confounds and the issues to empirically studying consciousness. And throughout your career, you've devoted part of your career to testing other people's theories, right? And testing your own, and also generating your own, which you're in the midst of with the perceptual reality monitoring in the mental quality space, and that's going to continue. What's the right balance between, one could spend an academic lifetime, just testing other people's theories. What's the right balance between testing other people's theories and searching for, the right controls, etc., versus generating your own and working on your own, pushing forward?
Yeah, I might give a recursive answer to that. In the form that whatever balance did one think it is, I think we should just do more empirical stuff. So I think so. If you feel like, okay, I want to spend X amount, like X% of my time thinking of theory, dial it down. You would never regret it. I actually, when I wrote the book, I sent it to one of my good friend and colleague, Richard Brown, and the first comment he gave was, "But the book seems to be structured funny. Like, why would you introduce your theory only in chapter 7? And maybe the most novel idea of mental quality space is in the final chapter 9. Like, why would you put it in the front?" And I think it reflects that sentiment or advice I just gave. I think we should just place much more emphasis on doing the experiments right. And I kind of reluctantly get into theory because at some point I needed to address some issues. And I do say I have an inclination. I hang out with philosophers maybe too much, and I like thinking about this. But every time I do it, I do try to remind myself this is an indulgence, and it's an indulgence that has not served the field too well. So I constantly try to force myself to do less theory and more careful experiments too. Even though theory is fun, I mean, everybody loves doing them, but
in your day-to-day thinking and research, do you find more stubborn the philosophical problems or the empirical problems or challenges?
I think ultimately the philosophical problems are harder. But I think the empirical challenges are more stubborn in some ways. It kind of relates to what I talked about earlier. I think in philosophy, at least you can be not so subtle. You can throw the kitchen sink at your best friend and you can still go for a beer afterwards, and they might like you. Yeah. They might continue to like you, strangely. Whereas in science, I think you have to worry about stepping on people's toes a little bit more. And given the state it is, I think doing empirical work can be quite challenging for not very necessary reasons.
Thinking back to your earlier career, and you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning, but do you feel like the problem of consciousness feels bigger to you now or smaller to you now than then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's kind of both. I think we have made some progress. I wouldn't say we solved the problem, as I acknowledge I don't think so. But I think we have made some progress, so in a sense the problem is easier. But with respect to my own life, it's certainly got a lot bigger. It become much more all-consuming, and the challenges, grew into different dimensions. So when I started out, I didn't think of funding. I didn't think of the importance of placing my mentees, continue to grow the field and keep a healthy culture, and go, try to fight back on some of these overemphasis on stardom and public engagement. And so that has become a much bigger problem, much bigger than I bigger than I could contemplate back then. Yeah.
So again, you detail a lot of studies in the book. What percentage of empirical studies about consciousness do we need to just throw away because of all the confounds?
I would think the majority of it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Oh, that hurts.
It does. It does. I mean, maybe not throw away, but we have to really think about them in a much more skeptical way, because just the task performance capacity confound is really everywhere.
Yeah,
it's really everywhere. So all the theories of consciousness has this similar flavor that consciousness is something bigger, better, stronger, more stable, more global, more deeper, more predictive, more complex, more integrated. And yeah, that sounds like how the brain should work. And maybe that's exactly because of that confound, giving you the flavor that you think you're studying consciousness, but you're just studying how information processing works most efficiently. So maybe we don't throw them away, but the recognition of that means that we have to redo a lot of this stuff, and it's going to be a lot of work.
Let's end on a high note here. Speculating on your own future trajectory, where are you in terms of the maturity of the perceptual reality monitoring and including the quality space? And as you project forward, where do you see yourself on the curve of your theories and your empirical research to test the theories, because that's what you're primarily concerned with, or at least a lot of what your concerns are. Where are you on that curve? Are you at the beginning? Is it halfway mature? What do you think?
I think when it comes to perceptual reality monitoring, I am feeling pretty good about it. I think the details are probably, my version would be wrong, but I already see other people picking up on my slack and innovating and doing better versions of it. So Sam Gershman wrote a piece that is similar. Mizuo Kawato, another really majorly influential scholars in the machine learning world, has also gotten into this problem. And I think they would do well. Even my version would probably fail, but I think the field would do okay. But when it comes to the mental quality space aspect, I think we are really still at the very infancy. And that's good. That means that there's more work to be done. I don't have to retire myself so soon.
You can let Passingham know. The fight is still going on strong, and for many more moons to come. Well, thanks for the book, Hakwan. And like I said, I think among other things, it's just going to be a super valuable resource for anyone thinking about getting into empirically studying consciousness, because damn it, there's a lot of confounds and a lot to consider.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. I don't do advertisements. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling amount and get access to the full versions of all the episodes, plus bonus episodes that focus more on the cultural side but still have science. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.
The stare